Good morning. My name is Caroline Danielson, and I am a Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for tuning into our virtual program today featuring the findings of our new report, California's Safety Net in Recession and Recovery. The report, as well as the slides from today's presentation, are available on our website at ppic.org. We would like to thank the California Endowment and Sunlight Giving for their support of this research and today's virtual event. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, I will first present some key findings from the new report. Then I will invite our three experts to join me for a panel discussion. And finally, we have set aside some time at the end of the program for audience Q&A. If you have a question for our speakers, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Again, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question. And with that, I will begin the presentation. Let me start by thanking participants in our stakeholder meetings that we held in January. I would also like to acknowledge Daniel Tan for his excellent research support and Mary Severance for outstanding editorial assistance in honing the message of the report. That said, all findings and interpretations in the report are mine alone. In spring and summer 2020, as shelter-in-place orders changed our lives overnight, the federal and state governments took rapid action. Poverty forecasts conducted by national researchers have found that stimulus payments and expanded unemployment insurance stabilized incomes for many and averted a sharp increase in poverty in 2020. But research shows that low-income families are more sharply affected by recessions and that these families take more years to recover their pre-recession incomes. And this pandemic recession has been particularly bifurcated, with tax receipts from wealthy Californians buoying state revenues above forecasts, while low-income Californians are experiencing high unemployment and hardship. What we aim to do in this report was to examine the response of the safety net in the last recession, the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession, and combine that with insights so far from this recession in order to draw lessons learned and assist policymakers in best leveraging the safety net to serve all residents in need as we emerge from this recession. Safety net programs typically have several goals, but one shared goal is to provide immediate assistance to families facing employment shortfalls that put them into poverty or near poverty. That is, they are a form of social insurance. We examined several of the largest safety net programs in this report: CalWORK's Cash Assistance, CalFresh Food Assistance, and the Federal Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC. We also looked at WIC and school meals, two targeted nutrition programs that are broadly available to children, and in the case of WIC, to pregnant women and new mothers. While it is important, in our empirical analysis, we were not able to focus on the California EITC or the California Young Child Tax Credits because these programs were not in existence during the last recession. Along with immediate assistance, other program goals include stabilizing income swings and supporting nutrition and health. Achieving these goals can help with longer-term outcomes like school success, better health, and economic mobility. However, during recessions, the short-term goal of immediate assistance arguably comes to the fore. And this report examines that short-term role of programs in bolstering family incomes. Looking at the programs that are a focus of this report, there is a clear federal-state partnership in funding the programs. Federal dollars, the orange segment of the bars, make up the majority of benefits across all programs. Federal law and regulations also play important roles. However, with the exception of the federal EITC, California oversees these programs and in several cases adds its own supplemental programs. Further, counties and other local entities like school districts and community organizations play important roles in implementing programs and also sometimes contribute their own funds to support programs. Our federalist system, national, state, and local, allows for flexibility and local responsiveness, but it also can create complexity that needs to be acknowledged and that policymakers may need to overcome in cases where it detracts from program effectiveness. How did these large-scale safety net programs respond after the Great Recession to meet a family's immediate needs? We used American Community Survey data for California for the years 2011 to 2018 to conduct this research. We focused on Californians living in families with at least one member under the age of 65 and at least one documented immigrant or US-born family member. We also did not study those who reported a disability. We made these exclusions in order to focus in specifically on the experiences of working age populations during recessions. It's really important to emphasize that we were not examining how much program support incomes, but rather the strength of the increase in support associated with higher unemployment. Overall, we find evidence of both increased dollar amounts of benefits and increased participation after the Great Recession. This happened in the nutrition programs, CalFresh, WIC, and school meals, and the growth is even true of CalWorks, California's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF program. This finding is in distinction to national evidence that cash assistance nationally does not expand in recent recessions. However, in line with national research, we also find no overall response from the federal EITC. This is not surprising, as the EITC is closely tied to unemployment, and then many people lost jobs or hours of work during the downturn. We also find a lot of evidence that need remained elevated even after unemployment began to improve. In other words, program benefits and participation remained higher for several years after the official end of the recession. Likely reasons for this include laid-off workers turning first to unemployment insurance, families relying initially on informal resources such as food banks or family and friends, and a slower economic recovery for low-income workers compared to high-income workers. At the same time, we examined and found gaps in the safety net for some key groups: adults not living with children and those in mixed immigration status families. Out of the approximately 34 million Californians in our sample for each year, we see about 14.9 million adults in families without children and 4.4 million families in 4.4 people in families with mixed immigration statuses. About 2 million of them are themselves undocumented. For adults without children, we find no measurable support from programs when unemployment rates rose. And it's surprising that CalFresh did not grow in response to high unemployment, because unlike CalWorks, CalFresh is available to families without children. And CalFresh work requirements that can limit access for adults without children are paused during recessions. EITC, it may have actually declined for adults without children, which is exactly the reverse of what we would want to see from safety net programs during a recession. Turning to mixed immigration status families, CalWorks could have been responsive, but we don't find that it was. It could have been responsive because children are typically eligible even when parents may lack documentation status that would make them eligible. But we did not find that it was the case. The federal EITC, not surprisingly, was not available because of ineligibility, was not accessible to those filing without a Social Security number, unless everyone in the family was filing with a Social Security number. To be clear, going forward, the Cal EITC is very different. It is available to those filing with both individual tax identification numbers, or ITINs, and Social Security numbers. So we would expect the EITC to, going forward, to tell a different story than the federal EITC. But for mixed status families, we did find that the nutrition programs, CalFresh, WIC, and school meals, did grow to help fill gaps for those families. We also found substantial growth in assistance for Black and Latino families from WIC, indicating its broad reach. In sum, our safety net does respond, but it has gaps, and programs are also simply complex, managed at several different levels of government by different departments. Policymakers then need a toolkit of responses to help meet needs during recessions, and I think we've seen several examples during this pandemic. As we've seen, the federal government is a key player in the safety net. So state policymakers can look to plug holes in the federal response. This can be challenging as federal responses differ from recession to recession, and the timing of federal responses can be delayed. However, during this recession, we have seen some examples. State actions to provide limited stimulus payments to undocumented immigrants through the Disaster Relief Assistance for Immigrants, or DRE program, implemented by community organizations, is one example. And also the Golden State Stimulus is available to both those filing with ITINs and Social Security numbers. Further, when designing responses, policymakers can provide multiple points of delivery. In other words, they can go to where people are. For example, during this pandemic, the state is providing both the Golden State Stimulus to tax filers, but also one-time Golden State grants for CalWORKs and Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, SSP participants. Another area of action was easing program access so that the safety net can better serve its immediate function. Actions included pausing redeterminations of program eligibility and pausing program time limits. Finally, assessing the effectiveness and equity of these and other actions for use in future recessions does seem warranted, so that policymakers will have these within their toolkit the next time we need them. In addition, policymakers can think about a framework for policy actions, one that tracks unemployment rates, not just overall, but among low-wage workers. This promises to better capture the needs of low-income Californians, which, as I've said, do tend to last longer than the official recessions do. Also, improving participation among those eligible for programs can assist in getting immediate help to families during recessions. For example, the federal government tends to deliver stimulus in part through CalFresh. CalFresh take-up has long been a state priority, as has outreach for the Cal EITC, particularly to encourage non-filers to file taxes. As a state, we have not tracked CalWORKs participation rates, but this could be an area for consideration. Similarly, continuing to connect individuals and families across programs for which they are eligible can help in both good and bad economic times to bring assistance to families at the point that they do need it. And with that, I hope I have laid the groundwork for a discussion about addressing immediate economic need in the wake of the pandemic and beyond. And let me turn to our panel discussion. As a reminder, please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I am excited to welcome our three leaders to our event today. First, let me welcome Mayra Alvarez, who is president of the Children's Partnership, which works at the intersection of research, policy, and community engagement to advocate on behalf of children, especially those from underserved communities. Next, let me welcome Andrew Cheyne, who is Director of Government Affairs at the California Association of Food Banks. The California Association of Food Banks has a mission of ending hunger in California. And finally, welcome to Director Kim Johnson, who heads the Department of Social Services, one of 16 departments and offices in the California Health and Human Services Agency. CDSS's mission is to serve, aid, and protect needy and vulnerable children and families, children and adults in ways that strengthen and preserve families, encourage personal responsibility, and foster independence. On our website, you'll be able to find their complete bios. Thanks to all three of you for joining us in this panel discussion today and lending your expertise. Let me jump right in. Our first question, and perhaps Mayra, you can take the first response, is California's economic divide is very much top of mind currently. Increased state revenues reflect higher personal income and corporate taxes. At the same time, unemployment rates and hardship are also high. Speaking of the economic divide in California, who are some of those who are most in need at this point in time?
Thank you, Caroline, for the question and for the opportunity to join you today. It's an honor to share the stage with Andrew and with Director Johnson. So I think the pandemic has hit so many people, right? I think it's important to accept that across the board, there have been challenges, whether it's economic or mental health or just a number of different challenges affecting us in different ways. But to your point, there are definitely communities that are hardest hit by what's been happening. And I think it's obvious that those that are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and its impacts have been communities of color, in particular, immigrant communities, Latinx families, Black families, many of the families that frankly have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, but that are actually also shouldering the frontline work that is keeping our economy running. The opportunity for us that are privileged enough to work from home is because there are folks on the front line that have made that possible for us, that have been able to make food delivery services, farm workers, keeping our offices clean, taking care of our cars. There are so many frontline jobs that are disproportionately operated by people of color who are disproportionately hit by this pandemic as a result. And I also think it's important to consider that even within those populations, there are even more marginalized communities. So within our immigrant families, our mixed status families, as your report highlights, there are undocumented family members who have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic and its impacts. Specifically, many of the federal programs and many of our state programs that we've expanded have not been able to reach our undocumented family members. Given the diversity of California's population, we know how important it is to really consider how do we target more effectively our recovery efforts in order to reach those most marginalized.
Thank you. Andrew, I'd love to hear your thoughts from your vantage point from the food banks.
Thank you. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and so proud to be on this with Mayra and Dr. Johnson. I would associate myself with all the remarks that Mayra just made, and just to add on, just so people are tracking, food insecurity has actually increased in California recently in the last 2 Census Household Pulse surveys, and we're at roughly double pre-pandemic levels with food insufficiency, which is nested within food insecurity. So these are folks who actively do not have enough to eat. Is nearly triple the pre-pandemic rates of about 10% of households. So about 4 million Californians with all of the deep inequities that Mayra mentioned. But that rate is far higher if we think about food insecurity, which is those folks and everyone else who has the toxic stress of not knowing where their meal comes from, even if they do finally manage to get enough to eat that day. And those surveys don't even measure hunger amongst our indigenous communities. And so I think we have work to do even in that space to make sure that, especially in California, where we have the most federally recognized tribes, that we're doing justice to the groups that we know have faced the most inequities going back to the founding of this country. The other piece I would just add here is that there are so many folks newly experiencing hardship. Right, there are so many families who were really just one paycheck away from experiencing hunger, hardship, poverty, other issues, and that's always really been the case. Is that hunger goes higher up the income scale given the high cost of living and the housing crisis, which never really went away during COVID. But I think in some hopeful regards that we've seen a real breakdown between some of the stigma associated with receiving benefits, with reaching out for help, really breaking down some of that us versus them, because it's just spotlighted how almost everyone is vulnerable to hardship. And I would also just echo what Mayra said about we can't take the foot off the gas right now. If we make the mistake of the Great Recession through an austerity mindset, we're going to consign ourselves to a decade of hunger and hardship. I appreciate that the report applauds that too, and that we can get into that in future questions, but there's really key opportunities at the state and federal level to achieve that.
Thank you. And Director Johnson, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'd agree. Thank you again, and appreciate the opportunity to be here, and also again share the stage with the panel today. Yeah, I would agree with much of what's been said. I think as was recently shared as an analogy, it was that yes, we have all been in this storm together. It has been tremendous, but all of us weren't equipped with the same equipment, supplies, boat, life raft to get through it. And so I think certainly we have seen, I think as Mayra highlighted, right, not only were we approaching the administration, the governor, this response related to public health and what we saw in terms of the disparities and disproportionate representation of the populations that Mayra spoke to related to the actual virus and the transmission of the virus, but also in terms of the economic impacts. And certainly I think it's been covered in terms of really wanting to make sure that as we, the state, identified ways in which we could mitigate those additional challenges, but also the additional federal relief we've seen, we've wanted to really be very targeted and focused at the populations who we know would be impacted the most in both places in some of the interventions that we've stood up. So agree that there's been just tremendous hardship across the board, and we knew where we needed to go in focusing intentionally on support for populations kind of pre-pandemic, but even more so in terms of what the pandemic exacerbated for those families, individuals, and households.
Thank you for that. So let's turn to programs and talk a little bit about how programs have grown to respond to need during this pandemic, programs like CalFresh and CalWorks. Director Johnson, perhaps you'd like to take that first.
Sure, glad to. Yes, I want to just maybe start with, and it's already also been pointed to, this response has required not only government and the adaptability and flexibility of government to respond, but also tremendous partnership with our community-based organizations across the state. So I would just say, overarchingly, the ways in which we have come together to support populations has been tremendous and absolutely needed in this event. We have, from our response, the department specifically, but the administration more broadly, have looked kind of across the board immediately at what flexibilities we could put in place that would make a difference. So, for example, in the CalFresh program, serving well over 4 million individuals across our state in California, if we're telling people to stay home, how can they access and get connected to that food support? So it was things like ensuring that we could get our EBT online purchasing system up and running so that you could get food delivered at home, and had some success with several retailers there very, very quickly. It was also, though, about how those that we were currently serving, and to Andrew's point, those that were newly needing supports, how could they get connected to the service? So for those who were currently served, thinking about being able to provide some flexibility on when we could redetermine eligibility, looking at, for those both currently on the program and newly entering the program, having additional electronic means to connect, so telephonic signatures and online applications, and a number of other ways that we were using multiple modalities to connect, whether that again was to keep people on and receiving the needed benefit or to get them on to the program. I'd also say, very specifically in terms of CalFresh, not only were we doing what we could in those spaces, but also at the federal level, applying for waivers that allowed us to have these flexibilities. That obviously we also had new programs being stood up in the pandemic, like Pandemic EBT, which provided additional immediate relief and supports to households that had children on the free and reduced meals programs in schools. So emergency allotments. So again, I think that the theme there would be that, and I think your report outlines this, is that we were both looking at what we needed to do to avoid any unnecessary churn for those who were eligible for the program, but to also get on it, but also to get out additional supports and relief as much as possible. And again, a number of both state and federal investments in that space to push those resources out. I think I would also just say in terms of CalWorks, right, we're right now in the middle of what's called the recurring non-recurring benefit, which is basically a one-time additional support to CalWorks families to, again, get that support out there, recognizing just the tremendous need. And I think to the points that were made earlier around stigma, the number of people who were actually receiving, for example, unemployment in California during this pandemic was significant and tremendous. And so I think that this is a place where, again, we saw a lot of adaptation and flexibility, but it's also a place looking forward, we want to really understand and unpack in terms of how we were able to reach individuals in need in this time. So those are just a few examples.
Thank you for that. It seems like the department has been incredibly busy over this pandemic. So thank you for your wonderful work. Andrew, would you like to add some thoughts from the perspective of nutrition programs?
Yeah, absolutely. And a sincere thanks to Director Johnson, to the entire department. Just to give one quick example in terms of the partnership with CBOs, it really was government at its finest. There was food rolling to food banks within weeks. It was really about 2 weeks. Incredible work by the governor, the legislature, but then the department to really execute, knowing that people had to stay home, as you spoke to, and they instantly lost income and needed food. At a time when the rest of us who had enough resources there were bare shelves, right? I mean, that wasn't that long ago. And so just real thanks. But fundamentally, CalFresh is a shining success. And this is why I love our flagship program and just cannot praise the state and counties enough, including the eligibility workers on the front line who themselves were experiencing this pandemic. I mean, for me, someone who had a direct role in what remains the historic SSI expansion, to see the caseload growth in the spring dwarf that, I mean, that really puts you in your place for the fact that SNAP CalFresh is an entitlement program. And for everyone who helped fight the bad 2018 Farm Bill that sought a block grant of that program, all the harmful regulations, we just saw the withdrawal of the categorical eligibility rule, the ABOD rule. I know we're a little in the weeds here, but like those were existential threats to that program, and we prevailed. And so I just hope everyone feels really good about that work. Just a couple more points to building on what Director Johnson said. And Caroline, you highlighted, for example, that caseload growth wasn't sustained in CalFresh. And part of it is absolutely not the fault of the state, but federal policymakers did not ensure that the safety net response interacted successfully between the programs. So the emergency allotments in CalFresh meant that if you were at a relatively higher income, you normally get a lower benefit to prevent that benefit cliff, but now you would be at the highest benefit level. And then when you received through the CARES Act, the pandemic unemployment compensation, that was not disregarded, that was actually counted as unearned income, right? And the state had no control over that. And so when that happened, when you tipped over the income scale, you weren't losing the minimum CalFresh amount, you were losing potentially $400 a month. And people were rightfully just distressed over this. And it was a very challenging situation. Congress eventually fixed that in a future legislation with the $300 a week. But it really shows that we need to have a comprehensive safety net response. And then in terms of the waivers in the fall, we saw what happened when the former administration limited the availability and the duration of those waivers. And it was not just in California. In several states, we saw caseloads decline that actually hampered the ability of the program to respond because the state wasn't able to utilize all of the features that it should have in terms of those waivers and flexibilities that Director Johnson mentioned. So thank you.
Thank you. Mayra, could you add your expertise?
Sure, I'm happy to try to add something to my fellow panelists. I think the only thing I would want to add, and this speaks to the leadership and quick response of the state, is really thinking what one of the themes you all called out in your report, that we can't be looking at single programs and how they're reaching Californians, but what are the systems that are set up to serve our most marginalized communities? How can we set up those systems to look at needs across the continuum? How can we support those systems to be more responsive? And I think that really came to life during this pandemic, right? I think even before the pandemic, there's many efforts that have tried to streamline systems in order to be more impactful and get to the holistic needs of children and families. And this pandemic made much more clear the need for that and the reality that we can actually make that happen. And the state has really taken advantage of these flexibilities of leveraging existing programs in order to reach families where they are. So I think it's important to consider, how can we think about that for the future and recognize that families need systems that are more responsive and more comprehensive in that response in order to recover most effectively from the pandemic.
If I could follow up just quickly, would you speak to which programs you think are more trusted and for what reasons? One thing that we found in our research is WIC appeared to be a program that was broadly responsive. It's not a large investment. It's not a state responsibility, but it appeared to be a program that people did turn to across, fairly much across the board. Of course, not for families that don't have young children, but within the eligibility criteria. So it appeared to be a fairly trusted program. And I don't know if in your experience that's borne out by what you've seen in your work.
Well, I think it speaks to the availability of WIC in the community, right? And the connections and trust that they've built with community members themselves. Many of them are embedded in healthcare clinics, healthcare centers. So there is this established history of working with communities directly. Also, WIC is very welcoming to communities of all backgrounds. And that's an important reality that I think has allowed for a more open door policy with regard to the services that are provided. And I think speaks to many of the lessons that we've learned over this last year, as Director Johnson and Andrew have highlighted, the critical importance of partnering with community organizations so that there continues to be a distrust of government at a high level. There continues to be a reluctancy there. How can we leverage the relationships that community organizations have in order to reach our families more effectively? And I think that is part of what you see with WIC. That's part of what you see with health centers in the community and opportunities that we can leverage in order to ensure families have access to these other programs that should be part of these holistic systems in response.
Thank you for that. It's 11:30, so let me just provide a reminder that if you have questions, please submit them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'll be moving into audience Q&A in 10 or 15 minutes. So let me turn to our next question. With the recognition from research, ours and others, that low-income families who are disproportionately immigrant and people of color have been historically more affected and for a longer period of time by recessions. There's been a lot of discussion in California and nationally of emerging from this pandemic more equitably. But how would you make this aspiration more concrete, given what you've seen during this pandemic, what you've seen in terms of the positives and maybe the challenges? What could we do to make this more concrete? What are some actions we need to take? Andrew, can I turn to you to start?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Yeah, so I'll start with some shorter to perhaps longer and more transformative actions. Just in the food space, we have co-sponsored legislation, AB 221, with Mr. Santiago to make sure that there are dedicated food resources for Californians excluded from CalFresh due to federal rules. And that is a two-step process with a permanent change to achieve food for all by expanding the California Food Assistance Program that I saw Jared Call from Nourish California mentioned in the chat. They're leading that with the California Immigrant Policy Center. Administratively, there is, I think, opportunities in CalWorks as well as CalFresh, and certainly appreciate Director Johnson's leadership here down throughout the department, using data, which they've already done to look at, unfortunately, strong disparate rates in CalFresh uptake for English speakers versus other communities. And there's a lot of work, including proposals in the budget right now to enhance language access across HHS agency, which we're really excited about and participate as stakeholders. Other work in terms of addressing disparate rates of sanctions in CalWorks. And so really appreciate that our director and our agencies are aware and proactive partners with that. But we know that both through stigma and the legacy of how some of these programs were constructed, that we do need to be affirmative in dismantling those institutional biases, and we have the leadership to do that. But then above all, I would just ask everyone to help us, if you're in a position where you can advocate to end the policies we know are rooted in racism and sexism and directly block low-income communities of color from the aid they need. So Caroline, you mentioned earlier adults without children. That is part of a package of horrible reforms that goes back to the 1996 welfare reform, where we block granted AFDC, took cash assistance away from predominantly Black and brown mothers and their children, creating the TANF block grant. But that's when we put in the restriction in SNAP, CalFresh, on able-bodied adults without dependents, aka adults without children. The immigrant restrictions in SNAP, the college student rule goes even further back than that. And there is proactive legislation by Congresswoman Lee, by Representative Gomez. Our congressional leaders are at the forefront pushing back against this. And I also want to applaud the President and Vice President Harris. The American Families Plan would wipe the drug felony ban in CalFresh off the books nationwide. We thankfully did that several years ago in California, but it's still a state option. And so I think we're finally really naming that those are rooted in racism and sexism, and we need to do that in order to really make the changes needed to open up access to our programs and end the stigma.
Thank you. Director Johnson, what are your thoughts?
Sure, and very much appreciate this question. Again, as I've mentioned, I think it was absolutely, and also thank PPIC for their research in this space, so that as we were approaching again the strategies and resources that we were able to deploy, we were thinking about this. And I again want to acknowledge that in the very first framework that the governor developed, this was at the core and center of, again, who was going to be harmed the worst, again, both in terms of health, but also in terms of the economic consequences. So it was mentioned in the report, it's been mentioned here this morning, one of those resources that we stood up quickly was the disaster relief assistance for immigrants program, supporting one-time relief, right? It was acknowledging who was not going to be served by the other relief that was going to be issued, and how could we address that gap here in California, supporting all of our residents and individuals. So that was a $75 million investment in that project, leveraged by an additional $50 million from Philanthropy, who's also been a tremendous partner to serve 150,000 individuals with some additional financial relief. Andrew mentioned it, language access. For our immigrant integration efforts, we must be intentional. It's been something that we've really focused on in this pandemic that, as Andrew mentioned, we are proposing to kind of double down on in terms of how we are conducting outreach, in terms of how we are posting information online, in terms of really our phone service, all across the board. How are we ensuring that the languages, again, spoken by our residents in our state are really accessible for everyone across our programs? I also think that, the how really matters. And so I think in terms of engaging, just some tremendous opportunities that we've had, that we've been focused on around really making sure we're in touch and engaged with community. I think Andrew mentioned earlier the tribes and our tribal connection. We had several conversations early on in the pandemic to say, where are the gaps? Where is there additional need? We were actually able to make connections between food banks and tribes in remote areas of the state to make sure that we were focused there, but we had to be intentional. And I'm grateful that prior to my leadership in the department, we had an Office of Tribal Affairs that was really working on allowing and supporting our relationship with tribes in a government-to-government fashion. I think one of the other things, and Mayra spoke to this, especially as it relates to immigrant integration efforts, is the relationship between communities and government and community-based partners. And so, for example, things like home visiting, which also had to be flexible and adaptable, and did some remote, we did a lot of changes in that space. But how is that then a way in which, for those who have not had that positive experience and engagement and are concerned about what is very true of the prior federal administration that created some fear around being able to access these benefits, how are we using those trusted messengers, those home visitors, to be the connector and bridge between the resource and those that need it? So I think that's another really key component. And then I'd also just say that kind of doubling down. I mean, we have had the great fortune, as have a number of other state departments across California, to participate in what's called the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, really giving the department tools to look at our policies with a racial equity frame. How are we thinking about our policies? And we have had tremendous success, some of those that have already been identified in a number of places with the legislature, with stakeholders, et cetera, to undo policies that were originally created in government that were rooted in truly racism, and we're not furthering supporting our communities at large. So I think the other thing for the long term is that those tools are going to be critical for us to, as we are creating policy, as we are designing programs, to be able to have a way in which we are looking at what exists today, what we are building forward with that racial equity lens, and doing it in a way that's always engaging the communities that we're serving. So that's a big piece of the how in the long term.
Thank you. Mayra.
Yeah. So I'm like nodding emphatically along with the comments that I'm hearing, because it's just, we have this incredible opportunity in front of us to be more responsive to the needs of our diverse families and communities. And I think as we consider the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's also an ongoing pandemic of racial injustice that has become far more apparent in this last year. And I think is sinking in to a broader community of people. Many of us have known it's been here. Many people have lived it for centuries. But I think there's a greater understanding of the need to have this racial equity lens, to Director Johnson's point, in moving forward. And I think really considering what Andrew said about how are we challenging how these systems are rooted in systemic racism and emerging on the other side differently is possible. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in this pandemic is more partnerships, is streamlined enrollment, is greater investments. And what of that is going to be maintained in order to be responsive to the needs of California families? And I think it's an obvious question that we ask ourselves, but I think is definitely a challenge moving forward as resources fluctuate, as things will get different, given the future is unknown. But really holding on to that, not allowing our families who are eligible for these programs because of barriers to enrollment, because of frustrations with enrollment, because of complicated applications, because of specific requirements, and generally a lack of trust in our communities to benefit from these programs, is only going to make things worse in the long run. So how can we approach this recovery from that lens, to my fellow panelists' remarks, is something that is such an incredible opportunity for California to continue to lead the way in making that come alive. And I think for those of us that are part of this conversation, those of us, the families that are involved, can really make that happen. And for us as child advocates, it's particularly important when considering that children are part of families and families are part of communities. When we're talking about expanding our California Food Assistance Program to immigrant communities, that is expected to create a welcome mat for children who were already eligible for programs, because it's that much easier. It's what we see in health insurance coverage. It's what we know is a reality. When parents are covered, their children are more likely to be covered. And we want to ensure that that's possible for more California families, and why we're trying to challenge ourselves and really pushing this opportunity of a racial equity lens to the brink of what we know it needs to happen in order to have a different reality for California's future.
Thank you. I know we've already talked about some of the program flexibilities and the new programs that were stood up during this pandemic. But if we could just revisit that for a few minutes, and if I could ask you to speak to perhaps what you think are the most promising of these flexibilities in your mind, the ones that we should really investigate and see how they performed, and maybe learn from them moving forward. Director Johnson?
Sure. No, very much appreciate this question, and something we've been spending a lot of time on as we are here on the day post our elimination of our roadmap and recovering and really going into another space. So it's certainly a conversation top of mind for us. And again, just want to fully appreciate the flexibility and adaptation of so many, and the quick work of so many that allowed us to be responsive. I think a couple of things I want to lift up that I think the report really does focus on that is worth continuing exploring. We have in California built the most robust safety net programs of any other state in the nation. And I think that to the points made in the report, and to the recognition of what we see in terms of getting these resources to those who need them most, we have to continue to strengthen our ability to connect them together, connect the array. What does it mean to both get access to CalFresh, CalWorks, and EITC? And what a game changer that is if you're able to do that in whole, as opposed to just one when you're eligible. And I think one of the things we've recently done, very kind of hot off the press just this month, that I want to highlight here, is that, as I mentioned, obviously we did see so many of our households and residents experience unemployment, and we're part of the safety net of the unemployment insurance program. And so what we've done is we've actually, really, again, working on robust language access, ensure that was a component of the portal, but we're connecting our other programs like CalFresh, like housing assistance, like health coverage, as a way in which, through that portal and engagement with that individual receiving that support, that they're aware of the opportunities that they may be eligible in applying eligible to apply for some additional relief and supports as that one in particular may wind down. And so just in the first week of giving a unique link in terms of CalFresh, we saw 30,000 additional applications in 1 week through that mechanism. So again, I think that how we're thinking about making the connection across that robust array that we've built is critical. Another example I think that we have been working on that we'll have to continue to do is our verification hub, so that it's not independent by each program that an individual has to then kind of demonstrate their eligibility for the program, but that can be done on the back end across all programs, a big effort of ours as well. But I think, again, in terms of some of the specific flexibilities, in terms of the investments, I think you could say our governor's May revision certainly speaks to the places where we think we need to continue to invest. Housing and homelessness, for example. Obviously, again, additional stimulus dollars, additional relief. And to Andrew's point earlier, making sure any of that additional relief that's given, that is in recognition of the challenges that households are facing and those that are unsheltered are facing, that we are ensuring that it doesn't negatively impact their benefit levels for those other programs, that we can really help people experiencing poverty gain the stability they need, that those assets are going to be critical for them to stay stable and supported. And so that's a big piece, I think, of what we're looking at moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Mayra, from the perspective of, how programs can reach communities, are there flexibilities or new programs that were really stood out to you?
Absolutely. And I think building on Director Johnson's comments, I think there's a program, and I know you all didn't go deep into your report on Medi-Cal, but that's another program that we know is particularly important and impactful for our low-income communities in California, actually many of our communities in California, and thinking through this idea of continuous eligibility for programs. So not having to require families to redetermine their eligibility, given that the fluctuations in income are often minimal, often go back so quickly, and that there's barriers that families have to face in order to do those redeterminations, whether it's taking 2 buses to the county office or having to take time off of work, luxuries that many of us take for granted that aren't possible, especially during these times. So this continuous eligibility of children and families in certain programs like Medi-Cal, for example, is particularly impactful. And we are so encouraged that the governor's budget included 12 months postpartum of continuous eligibility in Medi-Cal. The legislature included 0 to 5 years old continuous eligibility. These are the most critical years of development for children. So to maintain them in that coverage is particularly impactful in order for the future to happen. And it's also part of the systems approach. When we're considering how do we prevent people from becoming chronically homeless or people from having multiple chronic conditions, it starts with our youngest children and investing in early childhood development and those critical years. So finding ways in which we can support our systems to be more responsive to the needs of families, such as not putting these barriers on them as far as redeterminations are concerned or eligibility requirements, is just another way in which we can apply these flexibilities, these temporary measures for the long haul, and make the investments necessary.
Thank you. Andrew, if it's okay, I would love to turn to Q&A right now. We have a number of questions that have come in, and we're going to end promptly at noon, but feel free to bring in your response to this question about flexibilities as we move forward. But so let me turn to a question from the Bay Area about the cost of living in California and how that intersects with poverty and program eligibility. So the question is, I'd be curious what the panelists think about California providing supplemental funds by basing enrollment on the supplemental poverty measure or California poverty measure, which takes into account the cost of living, primarily the cost of housing, rather than the federal poverty line. Is there something you think there's an appetite for within the state? Feel free, if you don't want to take on this question, to opt out. But Andrew, if you'd like to take on this question, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, and this will be something I was going to mention anyway. It's a great question. So I'll just say 2 things. First is yes. I mean, we think across the board this should be accomplished, but specifically, we are on the cusp of achieving school meals for all in the state budget. and this ties back to the flexibilities because we, of course, have the waivers, which have temporarily enabled school meals to all children. But the proposal would make that permanent. And one of the reasons to do that is because we have so many families who experience hunger far above the 185 level of the federal poverty level, which is in that program. And then, as Mayra was just mentioning, we have a myriad, eligibility thresholds across, which can deter families. And so one thing the state could do is potentially look at, a supplement across the programs to better enable that. But specifically, I hope people are advocating for school meals for all. And the other place that we're really active on that is with SSI, SSP. We haven't talked about that safety net program yet. And the coalition that we're a part of, worked with Department of Aging, and the Master Plan for Aging calls for those benefits to reach the Elder Economic Index, which is not exactly the question, but again, trying to base our safety net in the lived reality of the low-income people it's serving.
Thank you. Mayra or Kim, do you have anything to add?
I would just say that certainly, no doubt. I think it goes back to, and I would say we do have an opportunity, I think, to work with the federal government and President Biden and Vice President Harris on some of these concepts in Congress. I mean, I think that, thinking about the cost of living in California and kind of how federal poverty level does not necessarily reflect that. It's certainly absolutely worth continued exploration. There are so many programs where we are taking into even regional considerations in terms of cost of living and how that then it helps ensure individuals can access those programs. So I think it's definitely worth continued conversation, especially here in California at all levels going forward.
The only thing I want to add is I think it also speaks to the importance of a racial equity lens in our approach, because there's so much stigma associated with low income programs or certain programs that are benefiting low income families, when in reality California is a great example of how so many of us are in need of some support. So many of us would benefit from additional assistance, whether it's financial assistance or navigating systems, food assistance. To Andrew's point, this is hitting so many families. Hunger is hitting so many families that may not have thought they were going to be in this situation before. And really updating the reality of the cost of living for California builds that understanding and builds an equity approach that can hopefully last, and make an impact in policy development in the future. And I know that's very high level and philosophical, but it's a reality that needs to happen, that this is a shared struggle. And in order for us to hopefully build more of a base of advocacy and support for these types of efforts, we need to have a shared understanding of how it's hitting all of us.
Thank you. It really speaks to the ways in which safety net programs are really social insurance programs. There is a question for me really about the report, which is how CalFresh could have been responsive during the last recession for undocumented immigrants. So just to be clear, what we looked at were mixed status families. We actually did exclude families that look to be entirely made up of undocumented members because of their ineligibility, but in mixed status families where some of the members would have been eligible, we looked to see whether there was responsive. The CalFresh did grow, and we did find some evidence of that. We have a question about the labor market and wages. This is from Sacramento. Currently, there are reports of businesses, especially in the service sector, needing to increase wages to attract workers. Are there special circumstances in the post-COVID labor market that might help lower income families recover faster? So I think this is sort of speaking to the intersection of, the safety net and employment, which we know is, the typical for low income families is employment. It's just lower wage or more unstable employment. Would anyone like to speak to the conditions in the labor market that can help families to stabilize?
I'm glad to just speak to a related component, right? One, I will just say, again, just looking at the proposals we're putting forward, one is the access to childcare. Mayra hit on that. The access to childcare and early learning for those that are engaging, right, is huge. We have a proposal of over 100,000 new childcare subsidies proposed and may revise. And I know the legislature has even more in their proposal as well. I think that the other thing I would just highlight here is some of the tax rebate proposals, right? We are talking about putting, whether it's the earned income tax or this proposed state tax rebate, putting dollars, focused and intentional about putting dollars in the hands of those engaging in the workforce that are still potentially at the lower wage. That's exactly what it's about, and supporting those families with additional supports and relief. I also want to fully acknowledge again the president and the federal administration with the child tax credit, another way in which that's going directly on a monthly basis in support. So I think, again, a number of different kind of specific economic relief strategies. Some, again, as the report mentions, are tied to existing programs and those already participating, but then we have another step to take for those who aren't maybe filing taxes and therefore aren't accessing but are eligible, et cetera. So I would just speak to just the tremendous package of economic relief between the state and federal government here that's proposed to support just that population.
Yeah, thank you. And really, again, points to some of the support of especially early childhood, which is so critical. And then the ways in which these programs also support work, have that dual focus of both children and parents, and the two-generation approach. Andrew.
Can I add on really quickly? I know we're running a long time. Just 2 quick points. One is, and I think the Cal Budget Center may have put this out, California has lost more jobs still than at any point in the Great Recession. Like, we haven't even reached the worst of the Great Recession. Maybe we're there now with the reopening. So we just need that reality check. And the second is, I just think that puts the focus on wages. You can look at the work by Hillary Hoynes and others. We've got so many low-wage workers going to food banks, on SNAP, and why. And so I just think that if we're really going to get serious about equity, as Mayra has encouraged us so well today, like, we've got to take a hard look at what work means and why people are still using safety net programs.
Thank you. Another question from Sacramento. We know access and investment in mental health services are more critical than ever. From your point of view, what do we need to do to meet the mental health needs of low-income families?
I'll just start by saying, yes, $4 billion proposed again by the governor, a huge investment there across multiple departments and agencies in recognition of that. Of all of the things that we've talked about, this is huge. And I think I definitely defer here to Mayra, who I know also shares this passion of really, this is critical for our recovery. This is really about breaking down stigmas and getting access to behavioral health supports and mental health resources and accesses to all. We have a number of things that we've stood up in the pandemic, like Cal Hope and other supports, but this was a tremendous experience for all of us. And I think that, again, as we're looking at who's hit hardest, that proposal in particular is in recognition of the investment that needs to be made to make sure our infrastructure is available and ready as those who need it are accessing it.
Yeah, yes, and I would love to add to that. So absolutely, that $4 billion was historic and bold and incredibly necessary in response to the pandemic. And I also think it's a reality. We need to call out that poverty is a mental health issue. Hunger is a mental health issue. So these interventions to ensure that families have the security to lead their lives, to raise their children, to contribute to their communities, that's all connected to the mental health of families in California. The anxiety that people feel when they can't pay rent or can't feed their kids or are skipping a meal because they don't have enough food, that is all contributing to the mental health crisis that we've been experiencing even before this pandemic. So I think it's important to really consider, as we are all looking at mental health, how can we support these initiatives and see them from that mental health lens, looking at this holistic continuum of services and needs that families need and deserve, right? And then to Director Johnson's point, then we can more target effectively the resources that actually need to go to people who need mental health interventions, who need mental health services and supports. Again, integrating them into those community settings like health centers or early childhood centers, where families families are, how can we train our workforce so that they are that much more equipped to be responsive to this wave of mental health needs that we're going to see. And I think starting with these sorts of investments, one of the incredible investments is they did a 2-generational approach in Medi-Cal, where families, moms who are enrolled in Medi-Cal can now receive services with their child, because that is so critical in thinking about families as a unit. And if we can explore those types of 2-generational approach in Medi-Cal and mental health delivery, how can we do those same types of approaches in other services? Again, trying to challenge the systemic change that we need to see in order to be more responsive and recover more effectively from the pandemic.
Thank you. We're just about out of time. And so let me just ask in a few words, what would each of you like to leave us with? Sort of how can we better serve Californians in need, or what makes you hopeful for the future? Andrew?
Sure. I would just say, let's keep hold of this moment where transforming the safety net is really on the table, just building off of what Mayra just said. And California, the magic of California is that we have to lead by example in our policymaking and in our advocacy. We need to be the ones asking for the North Star and not settling for less until we achieve justice for the families in need. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayra?
I think what gives me hope is this move towards greater partnership between government and community organizations, and really leveraging the power and leadership of community organizations in order to ensure our government can work for everybody. We've got an administration who's committed to improving its programs to be more responsive to the needs of Californians and to not have to do that alone. And so this move towards integrating community leaders and utilizing them and the networks and trust that they have is tremendous. It can be really game-changing for the future, not only in the recovery of the pandemic, but overall trying to strengthen California and what it's doing for its people.
Thank you. Director Johnson?
I would say this is an opportunity like no other. It's hard to say if it'll come around again. And I do think that there's so much alignment in the commitment, in the how we are wanting to go about our work and make the change. We have the brightest and brilliant research, and the policy and the will and the ways in which we want to do it are the right approaches. So I agree with everything fellow panelists said, and I think this is the moment and this is the opportunity to make real long-lasting change to disrupting poverty across California.
Thank you. Thank you again, Director Johnson. Thank you, Andrew Cheyne. Thank you, Mayra Alvarez, for sharing your insights and expertise. We could touch much longer, but I really appreciate the conversation in the past hour. Let me thank again our funders and finally our online audience. If you pre-registered, you will receive a survey, and we hope you will take a few moments to let you know how we did. Please all be safe and have a wonderful afternoon.